So this is also the church of the Europeans, the Portuguese to be precise. So check it out. It is very, very big. Whilst they were operating in slavery, or they were trading in slaves, they had a church here. So let me show you what is written up here. Portuguese church until 1637. So this is the church of the Portuguese. All is
Greetings, everyone. I hope you are fine. I hope you are doing well. I would like to appreciate you for taking this moment, this time to watch this video. And if you like this type of content about African history, African way of doing things, I will appreciate if you can just hit that subscribe button like never before. Every time when you talk about your story, there might be some people who might disagree with you or who might be offended, because every time when a victim tells his or her story, the perpetrator will always be offended. But I just want to say this video is not about hating anyone, it's not about segregating against anyone, but it's about the reality that took place here in Africa. And right now, Africa is reaping the consequences because people are colonized to the core. So when the colonialists came here in Africa, they stole African heritage, African civilization, history, culture, general lifestyle, um, archaeology. They changed the names of African villages, African regions, and everything. They started calling themselves discoverers or researchers. That is why we have the likes of Victoria Lake and many other names here in Africa. And they started calling themselves philosophers. They started calling themselves uh, civilizers and so forth and so forth. That is why right now, as we speak, we have what they call Greek philosophy or Greek civilization, when in reality, all these things were stolen here in Africa, including the history about the ancient writings. So that is why they had to change the names of Africa. When they divided Africa, they had to change everything so that no one would connect with the history about the ancient writings. So that is why right now there are many people who are like the Bible and other ancient writings came from Europe and many other countries. But that's not true. When someone steals your history and everything and manipulates you, and then that person makes you a slave, then you cannot trust that person to preach anything about good things to you. It can be about love. It can be about forgiveness. It can be about civilization. It can be about peace, justice, mercy, and all these other things. You cannot expect such people to teach you about such things. That is why even the theology is twisted so that people can be manipulated to the core. I'm not against spiritual people, people who believe in the scriptures, people who call themselves pastors and etc. etc. I'm not against anyone. But the reality is, you cannot expect such people to tell you anything about the Most High. Why? Because these people were practicing slavery. And then at the same time, they would go to church and attend church. And I believe that they would also preach to the slaves as well. That is why you have scriptures like slaves obey your masters, because they manipulated these scriptures so that everything can suit them. So that is why the people who build these institutions, we can talk about church institutions, educational institutions, and many other things that are related to education, were created and funded built by the colonizers. That is why the moment you attach yourself with these things, with these institutions, is the more you become programmed. And the moment you are fully programmed, it's even difficult. It's even difficult to be reprogrammed. That is why this content is not for everybody, because there are people who are like, no, you are telling a lie. There's nothing wrong about these churches and etc. and etc. But the most important thing is that based on history, they stole everything. In other words, if someone steals your heritage, your history, your culture, your language, you cannot trust that particular person with anything. In other words, when they preach about peace, when they preach about mercy, when they preach about forgiveness, you should not even listen to them. Why? Because they don't know anything about peace. They don't know anything about mercy. Why? Because they are involved in colonialism. They are involved in enslaving people. That is why right now, even now, many colonizers who are talking about peace and justice, their companies are still benefiting from slavery. Slavery in Congo, slavery in Africa in general, because Africans are still like their servants. Then as a result, they are still benefiting. But the very same people are busy talking about peace and love and etc. So if someone would even change the names of the people who are written in the scriptures, you cannot trust anything about their interpretation when it comes to the scriptures, their sermons, and everything. Because even King Leopold II, he wrote a letter to the missionaries and he told them, he instructed them that whenever you teach these people, when you preach to these people, teach them about poverty, teach them about loving the things that are not necessary, teach them about distancing themselves from the riches of Africa and etc. and etc. This is what they did. That is why I'm like, it's not about hate, it's not about segregating anyone, but when you know your story, you cannot associate with such people, especially if they are going to teach you about love, when they are going to teach you about your history, when they are going to teach you about your culture and heritage and everything. That is why even now, me personally, I'm not into traditions and many other African cultures. Why? It's because I've realized or I have noticed that many of the cultural behaviors or traditions here in Africa are also influenced. In other words, they've been influenced by colonialism as well. There are many of them. Maybe I may talk about those traditions in the future. So that is why whenever people talk about heritage, when they talk about culture, they talk about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And when you inspect or when you verify those traditions, then you find out that they also have greediness inside. It's because they were also influenced by colonialism. In other words, they have arrogance inside and many other things. Why? Because they were also affected by colonialism. So that is why right now it's time for Africans to decolonize everything that came with the colonizers. All the strategies of the colonizers must be decolonized. I'm not saying you have to decolonize your history. In other words, you have to separate your history from the mess that came with the colonizers. I'm not against the church, but if you attend the church, you have to separate the history of the church with the mess that came with the colonizers. So right now, as we speak, in theological schools or uh, theological seminaries and many other institutions, what you get is the mess that came with the colonizers. So that is why many Africans or young Africans who are growing up, they are like everything came with the colonizers. When in reality, they stole African civilization. They stole everything here in Africa. Then at the end of the day, they are like they know everything. They discovered everything. They even say they discovered Africa and many regions here in Africa, when in reality they twisted everything so that you will never know your history. Because the moment you discover who you are, the moment you know your history to the core, you will never think the same again. That is why, in most cases, they will often say, this doesn't matter, this is not necessary, and etc. and etc. Why? Because they know very well that the day you discover that all those things they do matter, you will start thinking different. I'm not against anyone, but we have to know that if these people were involved in a church, in other words, 99.9% of church practices today cannot be trusted. Theology cannot be trusted. 99% of doctrines cannot be trusted. And many other things cannot be trusted because even today, they still contribute when it comes to colonizing the minds of the people. But it doesn't change the fact that the history about the ancient writings, it's all about African history. But most of the things were twisted. That is why, even now, it's even difficult to find what is right and what is wrong.